Thank you, everybody. So yeah, essentially, I only know, I'm going to say like 10% of you to some degree. And I don't know how many of you know my work. You've just heard a summary. So what we thought we'd do is, I'm going to kind of, given Kim's general theme in life of finding our threads, finding our path through these times, I'm going to talk a bit about the path I've walked over the last 25 years, I guess, and many of the things you've just heard about. And then we'll open it out into conversation, because I think both Kim and I, all our work is really about conversation. I don't know how well those of you at the back of the room can see the slides, but I'll try and describe things for you. If not, those with really good eyes might notice that at the bottom it says Saturday, 13th of July, 2024. This is because I'm a big fan of the deep time perspective. And like, why does our calendar start in the year zero? Like, Homo sapiens has existed on this earth for 200,000 or 300,000 years. So I find it shifts our perspective a bit to recognize that this is 2024 in the life of our species, give or take. So yeah, just to widen us out into time a little bit there. And I think all of you here, I'm assuming, don't need telling about the various dimensions of the polycrisis, or whatever term we want to use. I'm just going to pick one statistic that always lands with me, which is that since 1970, so in the lifetime of many of us here, 70% of the wildlife on our planet has ceased to be there. Not just died, you know, gone and not been replaced. And that trend, amongst so many other trends, says something which I think is often overlooked, which is that radical change is not some like thing that we aim for, not something that we strive for and we're trying to overcome this huge impossible system and how can we ever get there. No, radical change is completely inevitable. Like, we either end up where we're headed or we radically change direction. And certainly for people living in cultures like this one, neither of those look much like today. So radical change is what's coming, not what we're trying to make happen. Maybe we're trying to steer it. Maybe we're trying to think about the ways in which we can affect it. But yeah, that's the context that we're living in. And for me, my kind of first stage awakening, let's say, was in the year 2000. I was at university at the time. And some of you may remember that there was truckers blockaded the oil terminals in the UK. And suddenly there were no cars on the streets and the supermarkets weren't getting food. And for me, it was a real like, wow, this whole thing's a lot more fragile than I realized. And that was kind of the start of my path with all of this. And I would say over the next 5 years or so, doing a lot of kind of research in my spare time, starting my career running a learning center for marginalized groups, particularly at that point learning about climate and about energy depletion issues. And then in 2005, I decided to quit my job because I felt like this is so big. I don't have a clue what to do about it, but I feel like this work with marginalized groups is kind of helping people to reintegrate with society, but society itself seems to be charging headlong off a cliff. So although I loved that work, it no longer felt like what I was called to. And so basically the key to my whole life story through that and everything you'll hear about today has been learning to live as cheaply as possible. I moved in with my mum. I just started learning the art of living very cheaply so that I didn't have to sell my time, so that I could give my time to whatever seemed important to me to do. And I had about a year, as it turned out, of being quite lost. And facing lots of very difficult conversations with my friends and peers who were like, well, what are you doing? And not having any good answers. What's your career? What's your plan for your future? Don't know, just think this is quite important. Need to figure it out somehow. My girlfriend at the time was supportive. She didn't get it at all, but she was very much like, I can see this is what you need to do. And then about a year later, so I was sort of reading lots of things, attending events where someone seemed interesting, harassing interesting seeming people. And then in 2006, I heard about this course at a place called Schumacher College, which doubtless many of you know. And it was, I think, just a 2-week short course called Life After Oil. But among the people I met there was Rob Hopkins, who was mentioned earlier, who was just sort of thinking, hey, I've had this idea for this transition thing. Like, maybe that'll go somewhere. And this guy, who you might be able to make out in the shadows, David Fleming, who said something then, among many things, but one thing in particular that really changed the course of my life. He said, large-scale problems do not require large-scale solutions. They require small-scale solutions within large-scale frameworks. And at the time, I was thinking, oh, maybe I need to get involved with the UN and the global climate negotiations, and maybe that's where the real action is. And this I've just been thinking about more and more for the 18 years since then, and it's really shaped everything I've done since. As I mentioned, Rob was there. It was out of that course that the Transition Network charity was created. And I stayed very involved with that. I was a co-founder of Transition Town Kingston in southwest London. Ended up writing, as Kim said, the second book of the movement, The Transition Timeline, which I think came out 2009 or so. And I say all these things because, as I say, we're going to have a conversation later. So if any of these things you think, oh, I'd like to hear more about that, then remember, and we shall talk. And also got involved in like policy world. So David Fleming was also the guy who came up with the idea of carbon rationing, essentially. And I started working with him on that. There was a government feasibility study into the system. And to save you the bother of having 4 years of banging your head against the wall, essentially the Treasury were like, yeah, no, we like economic growth, thanks. So yeah, that was quite interesting, but quite depressing. And then as part of that policy work, I was advising, forget whether it was DEFRA or DEC, the Department for Energy and Climate Change at the time. But then at kind of weekends and in my spare time, I was doing a lot of ecological direct action. This is just about a picture of the first week of Extinction Rebellion, but I was involved with Climate Camp and Occupy and Reclaim the Power and yeah, all kinds of direct action work, some of which I'm a little more wary of talking about, but very, again, very satisfying, meaningful stuff. But as Becca there said during her Climate Cafe talk an hour or so ago, the kind of growing realization that like none of this is working. You know, we're still kind of plowing on. And then the point at which I moved away from Kingston, where I co-founded Transition Town Kingston, was when we decided to set up a thing called the Ecological Land Cooperative, which now today has 7 sites around the UK and has about 100 acres under its control, and essentially is providing ways for people to access land more cheaply and without dealing with all the planning permission nonsense who want to live on the ground lives. And I'll just say again, like all of these things are large-scale frameworks for small-scale solutions. They're not saying, let's do this thing and replicate it everywhere. They're like, let's find a way that a diversity of people can get on the land and care for that land. You know, transition towns, let's find a model which communities all over the world can use to apply what they want their communities to be. And the policy was kind of along those same lines. And then in 2010, David Fleming, who'd become quite a mentor for me, passed away very suddenly. And also, 3 weeks away from that, my fiance also passed away very suddenly. So it was like my whole work world, my activism world with David and my kind of personal world blew apart. Both completely unexpected deaths and very sudden. And I really had that experience of, you know, my story of my personal future just ceased to exist, really. And I found myself in a very dark place. And one thing that my best friend Rachel said to me really helped. And she said that the best way you can honor someone you love after they die is to keep alive what was best in them in the world through your own life. And in the case of David, it was very clear. So this rather large book on the left, his Dictionary for the Future and How to Survive It, was a book he'd been working on for 30 years and never got published, never really finished to his own satisfaction. And he never let me look at it while he was alive because he said we were too close and if I didn't like it, we'd fall out. And he didn't want us to fall out. So after he died, he didn't have much close family, so I was involved in sort of clearing out his house and that kind of stuff. And I found the manuscript for this book and figured I was allowed to read it at this point. And it was just incredible. I mean, many of you know it, or Surviving the Future, which is the paperback which I sort of edited out from it. And so at a point where I was feeling like my engagement with the systems and powers that be wasn't really getting anywhere, and there wasn't really seeming to be any hope in getting meaningful policy through because politics was too kind of hostile to that. These books kind of represented to me a chance to step back and engage with the kind of underlying narratives and stories in our culture, and also really a way to honor David and Maria. And yeah, something I was very moved, very called to work on at a time when not a lot held much motivation for me. And these books kind of really, on a lot of different levels, were a kind of turning point for my life and for many other people's lives, because David's perspective for decades actually had been, so he was involved with sort of the early days of the Ecology and Green Party in this country. He was a former chairman of the Soil Association. He'd been doing, the good work for many decades before I met him. And he'd really reached the conclusion that, we're not going to collectively have a great turning to sanity. That just ain't going to happen. There's too much cultural and economic and social momentum behind this kind of endless growth paradigm. And so back in the 90s, he started work on this book, which was basically saying, well, if that's the case, then what? What does it make sense to do in that context? How do we prepare for the inevitable clash between this society and sustainability if it's not going to voluntarily turn? And what does it make sense to do now in preparation for that? And what's it likely to look like on the far side of that? What does that sort of post-collapse world look like? And so these books only came out in 2016, so 6 years after he died, but it really felt like they were bang on timing-wise in terms of an audience being ready to actually kind of hear this message and start engaging with these kind of questions, and kind of the realization that what we're dealing with in terms, I'm sure many of you have heard, is not really small-scale problems or large-scale problems. It's a predicament. We're at a point where this is not amenable to solutions as such, in the same way that the fact each of us is going to die is not something to solve. It's something to relate to in wise or unwise ways. It's something to reflect on. It's something to engage with, but not really something to solve. And so in this moment where I was facing a very personal grief and a very personal loss of a story of the future, as a writer, I was writing about that and finding more and more people were responding out of a kind of collective grief, a kind of societal, well, yeah, my story of the future doesn't make sense anymore, not because someone's died, but just because, look. And so then I suppose, as I would see it now, my question became, well, what does it look like to be in this context in a way which is not grounded in denial, but is also not grounded in despair? And honestly, I think that leaves quite a narrow path. I think there are a whole lot of ways to live in denial, and there are a whole lot of ways to live in despair. But the path between them, very often I find in people's lives, kind of defines itself, if you're really honest about your feelings underpinning it all. And this is now a friend of mine, Eve Anneka, who's a South African amazing activist. And she said another thing which kind of brought me up short, which is that our fundamental crisis is a crisis in ways of relating. And at first I thought, yeah, sure, relating to our environment, relating to our economics, relating to each other. But I think also now relating to ourselves, relating to meaning, purpose. And the thing about a crisis in ways of relating is that we can change how we relate. We can change how we want to exist in this time, what story we want to tell with our days. And so my last decade or so, I guess, I feel is beautifully summed up in this cartoon, which I don't know if people can see. It's basically an old man sitting on a bench surrounded by skyscrapers, looking quite contentedly down because he sees a crack in the pavement where a little plant is just breaking through and growing. And I think we all, hopefully, can think of a time when we have met someone or heard something or been to a place and it's been that little plant and we've gone, wow, like there's still something really beautiful here. Like even in this grey, omnicidal culture that we live in, there's still something like there I want to give my heart to, that I just think is beautiful and worthwhile. And of course it's not going to last forever because, spoilers, nothing does. But that doesn't change the fact that it's beautiful and that it's worthwhile. And so a lot of my engagement since in finding paths that are not grounded in despair through these times has been finding those beautiful plants breaking through the cracks of the currently, but soon to be not, dominant system. And this is one. This is my best friend's cabin that he built himself. His name's Mark Boyle. Some of you might know him as the Moneyless Man. He looked at the state of the world about 15 years ago and thought, pretty much everyone I know who's doing something they don't believe in, they're doing it for money. So maybe I'll just give up money. And he did. He gave away the boat he was living on in Bristol. He posted a message on Free Cycle saying, has anyone got something I can live in? And got given a caravan. Found a farmer who said, you can park it on my land in exchange for a bit of help at harvest time. Now he's given up electricity as well because nobody's told him how to make a sustainable solar panel. Nobody's told him how you can generate electricity without an industrial society, and nobody's told him how you can have an industrial society without devastating our home. So he now lives in this self-built cabin without electricity or running water. We have a nearby spring. And he wrote this beautiful book called The Way Home, Tales from a Life Without Technology, which I commend. About 30 seconds walk from that cabin is this, which is the Happy Pig, which is our free hostel, bunkhouse, inn, pub, where people can come and stay for free and be hosted, and just a place where people can exist outside of the market economy, just a place where people can be without having to sell their labor in some way in order to be allowed to exist. There are 6 of us who co-own this. It's in County Galway in the west of Ireland. This, when I encountered Mark, I recognized one of those plants growing through the cracks, and I thought, this is a beautiful person with integrity doing something I believe in. And we all know, we hear so much about, like, here's this green initiative, and you look into it and you think, oh God, green, right? But sometimes, you find something really beautiful. And so, in many ways, I think the paths that I've found that don't feel like despair or denial, and I don't mean to tell you what yours should be. I mean, I think your climate cafe certainly sounds like one to me, for starters. They tend to be about leaving the logic of the dominant civilization before it leaves us, about building the sequels, figuring out, like, what's coming after and how do we lay the seeds for that now? And it might be, creating a place that you think might endure, or it might be just, planting those seeds in people's hearts or their minds, or it might just be like actually having real conversations with people about what's actually going on rather than, living in this weird limbo space. for me, when I summarize it, I would often say it's about rebuilding the two systems that have always supported life on Earth before the time of the market economy. And I mean, money itself is only about 5,000 years old, but the market economy may be 200 or 300, and it's already destroying the very foundations of life on Earth, and yet it's still like, you're a nutter if you talk about things outside of that. But the two things that have always supported life on Earth are nature, obviously. That's the foundation of all wealth. And what I might call the informal economy, the gift economy, all the ways that humans relate to each other, and indeed everyone else relates to each other, that are not based in money. All the ways, like raising families, volunteering, like all the ways that we do things for each other. Me being here, talking to you now, won't be a spoiler given how Kim and I believe in the gift economy, that no money has changed hands here. And the more that we build that, that informal economy, the more that we learn to relate to each other in non-monetary ways, and the more, and that, you know, has been vastly under assault, and we've all seen, you know, like Airbnb calling itself the sharing economy, and all of this, like capitalism is trying to claim more and more of our lives and make it money-based. But fighting back against that, restoring the non-monetary economy and restoring the natural world, these seem to me to make sense across all future scenarios. These are rebuilding the foundations of the things that history teaches us endures when the monetary economy falls away and in times of ecological crisis. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to say is that I have no idea what kind of media you guys consume, but we rarely hear about things like this. And there was a wonderful historian called Howard Zinn who died around the turn of the millennium. And he said, always remember that. Always remember what the media are choosing to tell you about and what they're choosing to not tell you about. And he offered this advice that I carry really close to my heart, which is for every wonderful thing you hear about, and I hope this is one, but whatever's wonderful to you, for every wonderful thing you hear about, assume there are 1,000 of those that you don't know about. And I find that such a heartening multiplication, because you'll be told endlessly about, you know, Shell and Exxon and everything that they're up to. But yeah, to remember that there are perennially people doing beautiful things that you won't have heard about can just be such a bolstering thought as we go about our own paths. And so, yeah, to kind of bring my story up to the present, I mean, I live at the Happy Pig. I was there a week ago. I'll be back there in a couple of weeks, currently over visiting with my dad. And I also, as Kim mentioned, run this online program called Surviving the Future, Conversations for Our Time. And I'll show a slide at the end with links if anyone wants to follow up on any of these things. But Surviving the Future Conversations for Our Time is a lot like the Edge Retreat online, I think. It's essentially like, I don't have answers. There probably aren't any, but you know, let's come together and talk about where we are in a really open way. Let's share things that are inspiring and beautiful. Let's remind each other what's good. Let's talk about the things we've tried that didn't work, the things we've tried that did. Yeah, as it says there, explore some responses that bring hope and meaning amidst the intertwined crises unfolding as you read these words. It's a little bit, again, like that narrow path in this case between, what would you say, like the green dreaming. You know, they're like, oh, we just cover everything in solar panels and everything will be fine. On the one hand, and on the other hand, the kind of, we're doomed, you know, like, again, that path between denial and despair. And coming together to explore that. And this is something that's available all year round. And yeah, I'll give you the link. You can look it up or you can ask me about things. And so in a moment, I'll invite us all to open us out into a bit of a conversation. But I wanted to share a couple of lines that I carry with me. And this one was just a tweet I saw back in 2017 that I thought was amazing. Do you remember sitting in history class thinking, if I was alive then, I would have... You're alive now. Whatever you're doing now, is what you'd have done. And then possibly my all-time favorite writer, Wendell Berry, wrote this. Protest that endures, I think, is driven by a hope far more modest than that of public success. The hope of preserving something in one's heart and spirit that would be destroyed by acquiescence. And for me, that's a far deeper motivation than needing to win. I'm very involved with a lot of activist communities, and there's an awful lot of that kind of, we must stay positive, we must stay hopeful. And then every time you look at the data, you think, no, can't look at that, must stay positive, must stay hopeful. And that's exhausting. And that's the path to burnout, is not facing the things that you actually believe to be true. That's the denial path. But when we ground our actions in this, in preserving something in our heart and spirit that would be destroyed by acquiescence, that's how I want to live. I wake up each day and I'm like, yeah, I want to do that. And so, if I go out and I'm holding back a line of cops to keep them away from my compadres, for example, not that I think that's going to save the world. Oh, but it feels right. It feels good. It feels true to, as an animal sometimes, to just put myself physically in the way and say, no. And maybe I'll tell one more quick story, which I hadn't planned to, very quick story, because it comes to mind now, which is during the US war on Vietnam, there was a protester standing outside the White House at night holding a white candle, burning a white candle. And this reporter came up to him and she said, what are you doing? Do you really think that holding a candle outside the White House is going to influence US foreign policy? And he turned to her and he said, no, you misunderstand. I'm not here to change the country. I'm here to stop the country from changing me. So, my work goes under this name of dark optimism for reasons that are probably apparent by now. And if anyone wants to look up my work or The Happy Pig or books. Oh yeah, I wanted to mention as well that big dictionary, Lean Logic, that's been reaching quite an audience over the last 5 or 6 years, is now available completely free, in line with our gift economy ethos. So if you went to leanlogic.online, a fan of the book has basically not just uploaded a manuscript, but created a custom-built website that is brilliant for navigating the book.
It's amazing.
It really is. And it's literally a dictionary. If you want to look up, I'm worried about X, then you go and look it up, and it's an incredible resource, and it's free. And then, the Surviving the Future courses as well are at the bottom there. You can all come up and note down the links if you want. And again, being very careful to build in a scholarship model so that finances aren't an obstacle. I'm partnering with a college in the US, so there is some charge for that, but yeah, finances are never an obstacle. So hopefully that gives you some sense of the various paths I've explored in trying to find a path that is neither denial nor despair through these times. And really happy to talk about whatever you guys are up to or any of that you'd like to talk further about. Back to Kim.
Thank you so much, Shaun.